We're working on this case. We've read this,
Okay.
and we've answered those questions, and now we're talking about our answers. Okay. Now what I'd like to do, next is to get you to share a little bit of what you talked about with the rest of us. Is this case seem realistic to you? And does it seem like something that might actually happen on your campus? Yes? And can you see other groups for which similar kinds of things might happen? So students, now what is involved here is kind of priming the student. So the student gets some information from the environment that indicates that there may be prejudice going on. And of course, if you are a Korean student, how would you feel about being called a Chinese girl? And you know a little bit about, anybody know anything about Korean? How are they going to feel about that? So that's really a fairly serious insult for her to get. Okay. And you can think of other groups that might be subjected to similar kinds of rude comments and racist statements on your campus. Any other particular groups stand out that I haven't listed here that might be important in your campus? Disabled. Oh, good. Learning disabled. And overweight people. Good. So there are many groups subject to slurs.
I've had students tell me this, that in a particular class, a political science class, if you're a white male, in that particular class, if you're a white male, keep your mouth shut. Because you have, according to the philosophy of the instructor, you have nothing important to say in this class.
Uh-huh.
So political persuasion, I think, is what we're talking about.
So you can't even be part of the majority group and end up being getting slurs and create stereotypes and really derogatory statements. Okay, let's turn the page and go on to the next section. How do I scroll? Ah, okay. Got it. Thanks. Did that come up on the screen? Yeah. Okay, have you finished it and worked on? Now there's a little misprint here. It says the student decided to go to her advisor's or mentor's office. And it really should read that she decided to go to Professor Peterson's office. And it should be Professor Peterson that is responding this way. Sorry for that. Can you cross that out and make that change? And then go on to questions 6 and 7. I thought I was supposed to take 75.
That's what I thought you had.
Okay. And if you're done reading that and writing, talk to each other a little bit about that. Can I get you to finish up? And can I get you to share a little bit of what you've been talking about? What do you think of Professor Peterson's reaction to this student, and how might you react differently? Oh, there you are. I'm not used to a big audience, so I'm missing things here.
We were talking about maybe asking her how she was studying or who she was studying with. Because if she's studying by herself and constantly getting those C's, maybe she needs to study with someone who's getting A's, and then maybe she get a good experience from that.
So you might ask her, who are you studying with? Or are you studying alone? Good. Yeah. Uh-huh.
She starts studying a week before and pulls an all-nighter in. That can be detrimental to your learning.
Uh-huh. So you would quiz her about what she was doing and then talk about some more constructive ways she might study. Yes. So you would actually go over the test with her to get a sense of how she's thinking and what she's doing, and then give her some alternative ways to think about the process. Okay? Yes?
Having come from a different college background or educational background, it would probably help to ask if she studied here in the U.S. rather than asking how long she's been here, because that will have impact on how she would get or understand what you're talking about. If she didn't have the same background as what you expect of her.
Sure. So you would ask more about her background and what kind of courses she's taken previously. And I believe you had a hand up here.
Well, I was thinking, if I were the student, I would want to know what are the criteria for these differentiated grades. I want to know what do I need to get to a B or an A, and I would want to see examples of that kind of response. And I think as a professor, I'd want to provide that for them.
So you'd provide more rubrics and
Yeah.
more structured and sample A answers. Yeah.
That's where I was having a hard time getting off the dime on this assignment because I'm thinking, is she coming here with absolutely no feedback? I mean, is that what we're saying? Is teachers just giving her a C and there were no rubrics, there was no feedback, there was nothing? I was kind of having a hard time getting into this scenario because I want to know, did she have feedback? And if she had no feedback, then that's a different thing.
So you
Had feedback, then you need to communicate about the feedback that she had.
So you want to really investigate what is this instructor strategy for dealing with feedback and helping students improve. Yeah. Did he just get a C, or was there really feedback in an attempt to get some improvement? Yeah.
Is this the same student from example one?
Yes.
Then, my sense is that she's already gotten the message that she does not belong.
Yes.
She is an outsider to whatever this environment is.
You bet.
And so this instructor's question of, how long have you been here? I'm sorry, I'm trying to find.
Mm-hmm.
Instructor's question?
How long you been here?
Yeah, that's, insulting.
Insulting. Yes. Really alienating. And says to the student, not only is there racial prejudice among the student body at this place, but the faculty may actually have a prejudice against you.
A different
Mm-hmm.
What's your first language? That's a different question than talking about my parents.
Sure. And how about, oh, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to comment on that. It could have been, you could interpret it that way, but the professor might have been trying to get more background information so that he could see how he could help that student.
You bet.
But again, on top of the first comment, life has not been fun for the student at this college.
The students.
If she is the victim of the first example.
Yeah, but it's not connected. He would have no knowledge of it.
That's right.
Right, we're talking about student perception.
But from the student's perspective, this question that may be, from the faculty's point of view, is very well intended, a way to try and gain some knowledge and background, and to really try and help the student. But from the student's perspective, it can be interpreted quite differently and can come across as quite insulting.
Responding to a prompt, so we assume that it is that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what her reaction is in a second. How about that seventh question? Do you remember back to the ancient years, the prehistory? Can you get back that far and remember what was really difficult for you in adjusting from high school to college? Yeah.
Knowing what the real rules are. You got to figure out a way to survive in the environment.
Oh, yeah.
And once you learn how to navigate, part of college is learning how to navigate in the environment.
Do you remember any rules that were hard for you to learn or were quite a surprise to you?
Depends on what particular kind of idiot I was at that point in my life.
Yeah. Well, I'm asking you to go back and think about what kind of naive student were you when you started? Yeah.
Well, that's speaking for myself because I'm from Poland, so the environment was different, not such diversity. But my son currently is in college, and I asked him this question, what was the major difference? Well, there is a lot less presented in class. Most of the work is outside.
Outside of class?
So coming from high school, this was the major
Big change.
disappointment, I guess, he experienced. He didn't expect it.
Yeah, you're responsible for material sometimes not even mentioned in class. Big surprise.
I have a son in college too, and I would say also that it's a big time management issue. You know, for the first time, they don't have anybody, holding their hand, watching after them. Are they doing their homework?
Oh, yeah.
All of a sudden, have all this freedom and and a lot more time actually than they had in high school.
That's right.
Not in class,
Nearly as
every
much time.
day for 7 hours.
So it's much more self-discipline. I think of it as one of the largest increases in self-discipline that you ever encounter in your life. You go from where your day is structured, where you have supervision after your day, to totally on your own. In some places, they don't even take attendance in class, so they don't even check on whether you're in class. They expect you to do it.
I just remember that the bar was so much higher. And there are a lot of students who do extremely well in high school
Yes.
without making it. It's just not necessary. And then that transition, they don't do as well because now, say, you've got more information.
Do you have any other ways of characterizing how that bar is higher?
Come out academically ahead in high school, and so you graduate at the top of your class, and you go to a school where everybody else is that situation, and they say, look to your left, look to your right. Some of you aren't going to be here, and somebody's got to make the C's, and a lot of students have that difficulty adjusting to that transition, that you're not going to be an A student, everybody can't be. So there's that aspect of it.
Well, I like to think a whole lot more could be getting A's than are. But the competition is tougher. any other ways the bar is higher? Yeah.
Yeah, because back in a couple decades ago, you don't have the technology,
Sure.
and you have to do it by hand or typewrite it if you have typewriters, or you do it by hand. So technology has made kids now. They have spell check, they have everything to do.
A lot more resources.
Yeah, more resources to play with
Yes.
when they go in.
Oh.
I, as returning student, I don't know how to use those report calculators.
Aha.
It's tougher for me. I have to beg my teacher to please teach it to me because I have
Right.
no background on it.
Yeah, I'm back in the age also where typewriting was a big change in college, and a big change for me. There's one other characteristic that I find is that my students tell me is different from high school to college, and that is the idea of application questions on exams, where you have to show you can use the idea rather than just memorizing and tossing the idea back. So the idea of application level learning for me is one way the bar is much higher in college than it is in high school. And I find that students tell me that is the big difference also in high school between regular courses and AP courses. That AP courses were the first time that they were introduced to the idea that you had to use concepts and think deeply, more deeply about them, rather than just memorizing and giving back. And sometimes my students tell me nobody takes time to help them learn how to do that. That's something they have to figure out on their own, and I think it's one of the hardest things to learn. Yeah.
I teach at CSM math, but I also tutor a lot of high school students, and I would say that's one of the biggest complaints I hear from them is when they see something on a test that they have not seen something
That's right.
very similar before.
Yep.
They complain very loudly.
Vehemently.
Yeah, that
Yes.
they had to actually figure out how to do something a little bit different.
Quite different, yes. We're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what I call hidden transformations later in the afternoon, where I think that's often something that faculty do automatically, without thinking. That's just right at their fingertips. That's totally opaque to students. For students, it's a completely hidden system that allows you to do that. And so they're often quite surprised and quite angry that college requires a totally different kind of learning than they were used to. And so that's one of the things that I would talk to the student about, and especially by going over the exam, I think very clearly the student would see we have application questions here, not memorization questions. Well, let's go on to the next section, flip the page, and let's see what the students' reaction to this faculty member's comments were. Good. Okay, and after you've written, talk to your partners a little bit. Can you finish up in a minute or two here? Can you share a little bit with the rest of us what you've talked about? Okay? Sure.
We know that the class has been changed. Was it an anthropology? Was it anything to do with anthropology at all? Anything?
She never told me what class it was. But my hunch is it's a natural science class.
We think that might actually have something to do with the whole why she's not getting A's. We had a little bit of discussion over here.
Sure.
Pretty much, we thought maybe she was working herself out so much that she was actually failing. She wanted to make sure that she was getting accepted by her.
That's right.
But it wasn't happening because she was psyching herself out.
So this led to a whole lot of anxiety, and led her to really worry about this, in not just this one class, but it generalized to everything she was taking, and her whole perspective on the environment. Yeah.
Wasn't she stereotyping the rest of her professors?
Sure.
Also that freshman year, the first few weeks, you've got to find a groove, and it sounds like, because of that, she couldn't find her own, and then I think, she blamed everybody else.
Well, it certainly generalizes.
Right, generalizing, yeah. But maybe, they wouldn't want to be friends with me anyway.
That's right.
Roommates, all of that, and isolated herself a little.
Yeah, just a couple of incidents. One with a student and one with a faculty member.
Unfortunate, because that probably happens. You have a bad incident.
Sure. Yes.
I just wonder, is this the first time that she's felt this way, because she's really internalized it very deeply? And so I don't think that she probably had much confidence going into the events, if she was so able.
Another way to think about that is that the stereotype was there, laying in wait, and it just took a few triggers to actualize it and set it up and to have it become a really important thing in affecting her. But remember, the stereotype's in the environment that gets activated. Yep.
But the first professor, right? But the other professor, it doesn't say that any of them have done anything.
Sure.
Outside of, to help to carry this on, to make it worse, at this point, she's internalized. Now,
No.
again,
Yes.
the first two, and maybe
Triggers.
the trigger, if it continues, then certainly you start to, feel that way, you can't get out of it. But from the writing, at least, I didn't see any additional triggers or even, so I think I personally would be cautious about saying that there's stereotypical behavior among the faculty.
Oh, yeah. No, there's no evidence that more than one faculty triggered this. But the crucial thing is the effect on the student. And then we're going to take a look at some research that says this is not uncommon among minor.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I have the advantage of having read Steele's work on the issue of stereotype threat. And the way he began some of the initial research was around the standardized testing situation, where before I administer a test to a group, I say to the women, women don't do well on this test, and I administer the test. Or I walk in and say, short people don't do well on this test, and I administer the test.
Or men.
I say African American males don't do well on this test, and I administer the test. And in control groups and in these settings, I see that what I say before I administer this same test will impact outcomes. So my response is, this is the essence of stereotype threat, that minorities feel pressure that their academic performance, good or bad, is a measure of their ethnicity, a reflection of their membership in the group, and worse, a measure of the ability of group members.
Good. And you're, of course, jumping one slide ahead of me and ruining the whole lecture.
Sorry.
I think as an institution, we need to be aware that this is very common, and it only takes a few little incidents from the student's perspective, because the student is being thrust into, whether it's voluntarily or encouraged by their parents, to go to college in a new environment, away from college on their own. It only takes a couple of things to get that student off track to start thinking this way. So the institution should have things in place for these types of students to address these types of issues and concerns.
Good. Because the stereotypes are there.
Yes.
And they are just waiting to be activated, and it doesn't take very much to activate it. In fact, we're going to look at some research where it took a lot less to activate the stereotype threat.
We can't deal with the real problem until we deal with this garbage.
That's right.
It may not be her fault, but it's her problem, and she's got to deal with it.
And if we want her to succeed, it's our problem.
Do we have one of these Elizabeth Kubler-Ross kind of things going on? You know, denial, anger, bargaining, where you just have to kind of work through the stages until you get to the solution?
We'll get to some solutions in a minute, because there are some really, there's some really interesting research on solutions.
This didn't look like it really needed to happen.
No, but I hope you can see it does happen. And we'll take a little bit of look at Claude Steele's research. Can you ever remember a time being stereotyped and needing to fight that stereotype? Yes? So and I think we have, especially women, and especially women in natural science, will experience this, as well as other ethnic groups, so that the stereotype threat extends. And it can really extend to Asians, where very often we have a positive stereotype of them, but it can still be a threat to the student, to the individual student who isn't doing so well. Well, let's go on and take a look at Claude Steele's research on stereotype threat. Stereotype is a socially held mental picture that represents kind of an oversimplified prejudice or uncritical judgment. And there is a stereotype that African Americans don't have the ability of Caucasians. And that's a stereotype. Now, stereotype threat arises when one is in a situation where one has the fear of doing something that would inadvertently confirm the stereotype. So all you have to do is have the stereotype there and having a fear in the individual student that they would confirm the stereotype. Now, an example of some research that Claude Steele did was to work with Stanford students. And he took questions from the verbal section of the graduate record exam. So they're fairly hard questions. And he gave them to different groups of African American and white students at Stanford. So at Stanford, all of the students are fairly high ability students in terms of their test scores. Now what he found is when he told one group, this test is a genuine test of your verbal abilities, he found the African Americans scored about a standard deviation lower than white students. Yep. Can you all see that? Do I need to point that out to anybody, or is that? If I do that in social science classes or humanities classes, I always have to point it out space for space, but we have more natural science people here, so I think maybe that comes across pretty easily to you. No? Oh, my stereotype. It comes from years of experience of being shot down like crazy by my colleagues in humanities whenever I put up a graph. Okay, the second group of white students and second group of African American students were presented the same test material, but they were told this is a laboratory task that was used to study how certain problems are genuinely solved. So no indication that these test questions had anything to do with their ability. Simple ability versus general problem solving. What he found was the African American scores were not any different than the Caucasian students. So just by changing the instructions, the one set of instructions carried with it the implication that their ability was being tested. And that triggered the stereotype. And that triggering of a stereotype actually lowered their scores a significant amount. So we started this with an example of one student, but here we have a case that it really dramatically affects the scores of a large group of students. Question?
Oh, I just had a question, because, when we give tests, they are assessing their ability, and they know that, so that triggers their stereotype slide anyway. So are you going to maybe tell us how to get around that?
I'm going to, I don't have a, well, I do. I'm going to give you some stuff that I have used that had a huge impact on my African American students. Now, the second thing I want you to know is we find when we do similar tests on quantitative reasoning, with women, we get the same kind of results. If they're told it's just problem solving, they score even with white males. If they're told it's a test of their quantitative ability, we get these kind of results for women too. So stereotype threat affects not only African American, but it strongly affects women as well. Now, we've also done studies where we compare white males with Asian males, and we tell the students there's evidence that Asian males outperform white males on the test, and we get these same kind of results. So this stereotype threat research is very solid. It has these kind of effects. What do we do about this? Now let's go to wise schooling. Can you flip the page? Now, Craig, in his presentations later in the day, are going to give us some simpler ways to have an impact on stereotype threat. And there's some research to indicate those simpler ways work. But this is one study I found particularly valuable because so much of the time we're white instructors dealing with African American students or male instructors dealing with female students. And so this study was, how can a Caucasian mentor convey feedback to African American students and have that feedback be trusted and used by the African American student. In this study, one of Claude Steele's students, Cohen, and Steele and Ross did this study called The Mentor's Dilemma, Providing Critical Feedback Across the Racial Divide. They did this little study in which they had students write essays about their favorite teachers for possible publication in a journal. And they did 3 different groups. The first group received negative feedback about their essay in an unbuffered way. The second group received the same type of critical feedback, but it was cushioned by a generally positive feedback statement. Now, the third group received similar critical feedback, but it was preceded by first an anti-stereotype threat statement, and second, a statement that there was evidence that the students had the ability to meet the higher standards provided by the test. Now, I was so interested in this and so fascinated, I actually wrote down the instructions. So, and especially what I was attracted to was this generally positive cushioned statement. Can you read that there? Overall, nice job. Your enthusiasm for your teacher really showed through, and it's clear that you must have valued him or her a great deal. You have some interesting ideas in your letter and make some good points. In the pages that follow, I've provided some more specific feedback and suggested several areas that could be improved. Now, I can't tell you the number of times I have written feedback like that to my students. The reaction of the students, especially the minority students, number one, they don't trust it. And number two, they're not motivated to make any changes. Oh, come on, give me a break. That's their reaction exactly. Okay, now, the anti-stereotype threat statement, it's obvious to me you've taken your task seriously. I'm going to do likewise and give you some straightforward, honest feedback. The letter itself is okay as far as it goes. You followed the instructions, listed your teacher's merits, given evidence to support them, and importantly, produced an articulate letter. On the other hand, judged by a higher standard. In my classes, the students are all judged by a college level standard they're not used to, a professional standard. I want them to write so it's really acceptable in the field of psychology. So telling them you're being judged by a higher standard, one that really counts. That is whether your letter will be published in a journal. I have serious reservations. The comments I provide in the following pages are quite critical, but I hope helpful. Now, second, and this one really surprised me, and it's something I never would do naturally. Remember, I wouldn't go to the trouble of giving you this feedback if I didn't think, based on what I've read in your letter, that you are capable of meeting the standards I mentioned. So 2 pieces. 1, you're being judged by higher standards. And 2, you have the capability to meet these standards. And I have evidence of it in your work. When both of those were made explicit, the students trusted the criticism from the white mentor, remember, and saw it as unbiased and were motivated to take their essays home and work on them. So the students trusted this negative feedback when it was made clear that higher standards were involved, and 2, that the instructor saw something in their work that indicated that they had the ability. Now, I've since tried to highlight in yellow the section of every student paper which indicates to me they have the ability to meet my higher standards. And if I look for it, in almost every paper I can find some place where the student has shown the ability to do the work. I now actually write out, this shows you have the ability to do the work that's expected in this class. If the rest of your essay had been as good as these sections, you would be receiving A's. Now, when I did this, much to my surprise, a student, an African-American student, came up and said to me, "Would you be my advisor? I need someone around here who will be really straight with me." That is, this student was hungry for feedback that indicated to her, number 1, where she needed to improve, and 2, that I had confidence in her ability to do this. Now, I find that is a very powerful way to challenge stereotype threat, where you as an authority figure are actually pointing out to a student where they have the ability to do the work. And you actually say that. Now, I use this case with a large number of my students, my advanced students, in an advanced psychology class. And when we were done with it, a couple of them raised their hand, and one said, "You know, Dr. Grossman, nobody at this college in the 4 years I've been here has told me I have the ability to be here." And I was shocked. These students were all A-B students. 2/3 of them were going to graduate school. They were my best students. And I had never mentioned to them that they have the ability to do the work in the field. So I have absolutely transformed the way I give feedback on papers to both my African American and my Caucasian and my Asian students, where I see evidence that they have the ability to do the work. I really challenge, and what I find is that the students, all of my students benefit from getting that kind of feedback. And it's feedback that indicates both the higher standards involved as well as evidence that they can meet those standards or that they have the ability to meet those standards. Questions, comments, reactions? They're working on problems and make a little mistake. They call themselves stupid because they really believe it. Deep down inside, they're not convinced. And I can remember not being convinced I was very smart. I remember a dramatic experience my freshman year in college in a biology class. I got my paper back and I got 100 on it. And that was the highest paper, and there were 200 students there. And that's the first time I began to think, maybe I'm not stupid. So I think it's endemic among students, but especially worse and especially problematic among our minorities.
Also, as a parent and a teacher now looking at kids that sometimes they are very, when they're very
Or C, yeah.
Then they're up, this subject matter isn't for me, and they have to be worked through. They may
That's
get
right.
that support at home, or they may not be getting that support at home, but it would be great if they're getting it from the person who's giving the course, so that they will have the wherewithal, the stamina, and everything to work through it and realize, oh, well, maybe I still could be
That's right.
whatever they were studying.
That's
So,
right.
but the first falter, if it's not easy for them, it can be a real big stumbling block to success.
Yes, and I think we want to relate this a bit to what Craig was talking about this morning. All of those things are really helpful, but they also can use some encouragement to challenge their misconceptions about themselves and the stereotypes they have to deal with. Yeah.
I think to tag on to what you said about your students saying, your AV students saying that they've never had a professor in the 4 years tell them about their ability, I think that we forget our students that are doing well. We think they're all
Yep.
just fine. And just this semester, I started writing to all my students that I have on web to tell them, good job, how about you try this or go about it this way. And the number of A students that wrote back and said, thank you so much for noticing that I was doing what you asked, or thank you for the encouragement, and the grades stayed there as opposed to going, well, you know, nobody cared, why should I bother?
Neat. Yes.
Where this needs to happen is with our freshmen and sophomores, which are traditionally the larger classes. So when you've got a class of 150, 200, 300 students, how do you do this? Do you copy paste? And then the students start to realize you're copying and pasting, and it's no longer individualized, and you just lost the power of it.
Yeah, we all have limits with time, but TAs can be taught to do this. They can be taught to pick out parts of the students' answers that were really correct and good and write positive feedback about it. And they can even be taught to say that you have the ability to, if you do more of this, that you really have the ability to do it. But so that I think that logistics are always a problem, but there are ways around it, and it doesn't take much time on assignments to use a yellow highlighter to highlight stuff and just write. You really show you have the ability here. That's a few seconds, but I think you may find it has a powerful impact that makes a difference, and especially a difference for students that we often don't do well with. And I think it's much more important in our field when we need to get students really engaged and involved in this so that they understand the material deeply enough to do well. Okay. Craig?
Thanks, Bob. I think you got the microphone.
Well, we'll have to trade.
I think so.
I can't see it.
Can't see where I put it? Testing, 1, 2, is pretty good. To build, just in passing on what Bob was recently saying, one study noted a Harvard senior who said the high point of his undergraduate career was when one graduate grading assistant took time to write good point on his paper once in 4 years. Inside Higher Education this week, yesterday I think it was, has an article on the effect of cross-course, cross-semester coaching, assigning each student a coach to help them keep track of what they're doing and how they're doing and why.
And they find that that is really key to increasing persistence, especially of at-risk college students, first generation, et cetera. So you may want to check out Inside Higher Education for the article, which is online, free of course, for the article on coaching. And think about how you can do it. They're doing it by outsourcing the coaching. Right? But of course, if we aren't careful, all of the faculty's roles are going to be outsourced. And then they're going to notice they don't need us. Many introductory courses are now being outsourced to adaptive or intelligent on-web courses, right, that respond to each student individually. And all you have to do is build in a little good job. That really shows you're going somewhere into the program. And you could do a lot of what we're doing here. At the moment, what they do is, as you miss problems, they focus on how you miss them. And come up with individual tutoring, which is impossible to do with faculty, of course, or almost impossible. And as a final aside, before I turn back to a couple of ways where you can make a real difference in the direction Bob was pointing at, there's a paper called Professorial Melancholia, as in professors, which suggests that people go to graduate school when they need to take frequent exams so that they can tell how smart they are. They need frequent positive feedback. And that the frequency of that somewhat decreases in the dissertation process. And when they become faculty, they get almost no positive feedback, and they become neurotic. He proposes this seriously as a new definition of neurosis, produced by the fact that we don't pay enough attention to each other to provide the kind of positive feedback and coaching and attention that says, well, here's where I can really tell. Not just good job, but here's where I can really tell that you're working with the students. So we could even bring this home to the question of how do we structure departments so that we are providing feedback enough to keep the older faculty from going any crazier, and perhaps enough to keep our younger colleagues a lot saner. You have another handout with a page 1 on that same side, on which the page 2 looks like this. This is the one that's marked for using this afternoon. Let's see, now I have to, I'll bet I can't do this without pulling it back, never mind. This is insane, but I've not used this mirroring system before. Ha. Isn't that interesting? Oh, right. See what that did. I want to go to page 2 here, and I'm having trouble getting this PDF to resize just enough to get it on here. Let me try again. One more minute. Why don't you stand up and stretch for a second? Let me see what happens if I just do this. No. All right, view. Zoom. To. All right, page 2. Some psychologists created in the lab, they wanted to make every student anxious. So they created a math test that was at the range where they would get variable scores. They weren't all going to max out, and they weren't going to mostly blow it. And they gave them a payout. The higher your score, the more money you got. And then if that wasn't enough, they said you're actually working in teams, but you don't know who the other member of your team is. And the higher your score, the more money the other person's going to get too. Okay, so this was designed to raise the seriousness with which the students took it, what they called the anxiety. They then had 3 treatments, one of which was they wrote, the students for 10 minutes right before the exam, wrote about their thoughts and feelings regarding the upcoming test. The second group sat quietly for 10 minutes. And the third group wrote a little essay on other things that wasn't emotional for 10 minutes. Are you with me? All right. The ones who wrote about their feelings about the exam did 10% higher than either of the controls. Simply writing about one's worries before a high-stakes exam can boost test scores. I think the implications of that are fairly clear, right? It was a modest number of students in a lab. They then did it in high school biology and showed if you took they gave a test of anxiety. The half who were most anxious went up by about 10 points. Half of the whole class went up. The ones who they made most anxious. All right. No, they didn't make them anxious. They took the standing anxiety. Sorry. They gave them a test of anxiety and then had them do the writing. And the 50% who were most anxious went up by 10% or so. Are you with me? And the citation is there so you can find it relatively easy. But the key thing is writing about how anxious you are about the exam you're about to take reduces the anxiety. This is a standard rule in some kinds of thinking about psychology, which is when you express an emotion, you reduce its force. The first time you say, I love you, it means more than the 10th time in 10 minutes. You reduce the force to you and you reduce the force to the recipient, right? Second one. Bob's gone over Stereotype Threat for you, lovely. And this is in physics at the University of Colorado. Colorado is where Carl Wyman started and won his Nobel Prize, and he's now moving back and forth between there and UBC, leading 2 institutions through STEM reform at a major level, like millions of dollars. And so they've already straightened out the physics course using a lot of interactive learning. And they're still having a residual gap between men and women that they'd like to close. So they gave them a test of how much do you endorse the statement that I expect men to generally do better in physics than women. And they built that into a survey of attitudes that the students all had to take online. So it wasn't just cold in the sense of bang. It was you're going through a whole bunch of other attitudinal measures, and that one stuck in. Are you with me? All right. They then divided the women into those that endorsed the stereotype and those that didn't. So far, so good. And they had then everybody, or they had a control group, but the experimental group in their first discussion section in physics was asked to take one of a series of values, which are listed on the next page down in italics, values list, being good at art, creativity, relationships with families and friends, government, politics, independence, learning and gaining knowledge, athletic ability, belonging to a social group. You with me? They were asked to pick 3 of those that were really important to them and write about 2 or 3 that are most important. And one of the controls picked 2 or 3 that weren't important to them, but they thought were important to some other people, and write about why they might be important to other people. Are you with me? So the control is also doing writing about values, but not about their own values. And the experimental treatment, the one they really were aiming for, is writing about their own personal values. They wrote about it once the first week of class in their discussion section, and then they were assigned to do it again, whichever treatment they were in, to do it again in the week before the first exam. Are you with me? So they did 2 10 to 15 minute writing tasks, one in class, one online. All right. And the results are in the graph. The gray lines are men who endorsed and didn't endorse stereotype threat, and on conceptual learning, it's the 2 treatments for men, writing about their own values and not, and for some reason, not was better here, but it was the same for both men over here. But the really interesting effect is on women. The women who had high stereotype threat and didn't write about it, as you can see, did about 55%, versus the ones who did write about it did about 68% on the exams for the course as a whole. A better than 10-point improvement. For the women who were pulled down by stereotype threat, writing twice about their values, got rid of the stereotype threat, and they now do as good as men. And on the force, motion, concept, etc., conceptual inventory in physics, which is a test of do you really understand physics? The low stereotype threat, men and women are the same, whatever treatment they're doing. But high stereotype threat, men drop down a little bit, both the control and the treatment. The control women are back down at 55%, and the women who wrote about their values are now up to almost 80%. So better than a 20% improvement. Are you seeing this? Okay. So I would say that the bottom line is we ignore the affective. We ignore anxiety. We ignore values. And what these studies are showing is that if you have people write about their anxieties and write about their values, the students who are anxious, either because of stereotype threat or because of personal feelings of inadequacy, are going to do better. And we would have initially taken this to be a waste of time. But if you can put 20 points onto some of your students' conceptual understanding this easily, and this is after you've already done the active learning stuff, right? This is all against the background of highly competent physics teaching. This is not traditional teaching physics. This is using the best research we know on college teaching, and you can still have this big effect on top. And you don't have any other, they didn't have any other way to get it. You get a big effect, you get it cheap, and you don't know how else to get it. So at the bottom of the page it says, which groups might feel anxiety or stereotype threats in your courses, and how could you either get them to affirm values or express anxieties or otherwise reduce the anxiety and threat that otherwise would keep them from doing well. Are you with me? So how could you do that relatively quickly? Or you can do it more elaborately like Bob did, right? But we're looking for ways that are, if you've got 100 students, you can't have them, as somebody was saying, what if we got 300 students? It's hard to do Bob's method. But they're doing this with a big lecture class in physics. So you can see if they can do it with a big lecture class in physics, it is not insurmountable. And you don't even grade the essays. I mean, you really have them write the essays and glance at it to see if they did it, I suppose. But there's nothing to grade about an essay on why I really think art's important, right? In a physics class. And they justified it as it's important for physicists to communicate. So write down 2 or 3 ideas on what you might do. That's what I was thinking.
And what you'll need to do is tell people to run out these doors. Lunch is going to be out here in the atrium for them. Okay?
And do they bring it back in here?
I'll bring it back in here. So
And you'd like me to tell them that?
yes, after you're finished.
I'd love to do that, Teresa. And it's probably not essential that all groups finish at the same minute.
True.
But, so I'll take 2 or 3 minutes of
But
flex.
what happens is I need you to finish first.
Oh,
Because all of the tables are mostly
I will finish
here.
first. And talk with your neighbors as you're ready. If you need the methods in detail, they're on the next page. If you need the methods in detail, they're on page 3. Now, let's see what I can do about sleep. Sleep would be down here on settings. What I have to do is to move this up. I can leave it here for now. And now let me have your attention for just a second. We are now officially taking a break for lunch. Lunch is right out there. You get to bring it back in here. You've got first shot at your chairs, so if you want to leave your shirt or something on the chair, it'll be yours when you get back.